Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Proclaim Peace podcast, where we talk about what the restored gospel teaches about conflict and how we can become better peacemakers. I'm your co-host, Patrick Mason, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Jennifer Walker-Thomas. Hey, Jen.
Hello, Patrick. I am so excited to be here. I am so excited about this project.
I know, me too, me too. So if we think back to our last episode, we with Emma Petty Adams, we were talking about really what we hope to accomplish in this first season of the podcast. That we're calling the Book of Mormon for Peacemakers. And today's going to really be the first day that we really start to dive into the book itself, especially with First Nephi, the first book in the Book of Mormon. So, Jen, I'm just curious, how many times do you think you've read First Nephi in your life?
I'm not going to tell you the answer to that question because it would imply that I have read the Book of Mormon thousands of times. There's not a direct
Right.
correlation with the number of times I've read those first few verses and the number of times I've finished the book, though I have finished the book a lot. And I have to say that it has been a really remarkable experience as we've launched this project. In spite of the many, countless, honestly, times that I have read the Book of Mormon cover to cover, just reading it with this new lens, reading it kind of following President Nelson's counsel to be a peacemaker and saying, what can I find in this text that will help me do that? It has given me a whole new appreciation for what, right up front, Nephi is trying to teach us, and then ultimately through the whole text, what God is trying to communicate to us as people.
Yeah, I've had a very similar experience. I mean, I'm just so struck by, or have been struck by, right out of the gates. This is a book that narrates all kinds of conflicts coming at it from lots of different angles, mostly within a family, which is where most of us, our deepest relationships that last the longest. And so we've got
And
parents.
our hardest conflict, right? Sometimes our most painful
Exactly.
conflict. Yeah.
Yep. So we've got conflict between spouses, between parents and kids, between siblings, right? All of these different vectors. Not to mention Nephi and Laban. We will talk about Nephi and Laban in a later episode. So stay tuned for that. But just all these different vectors of conflict.
Yeah, and I think that as I've been reading, particularly with the lens to family, thinking about the lens of family conflict, right? Thinking about how families behave and interact with each other and what some of the consequences are of that. I just keep thinking of the Leo Tolstoy quote from Anna Karenina, which is basically that happy families are all alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in their own way. And I think if you
Right.
look at the Book of Mormon, that really plays out there, right? Sadly, we don't see a lot of stories of happy families, probably because there's not a lot to tell. A happy family just feels like it's working. But I think there's something important we can take away from that. I think by including unhappy families, including conflict, I think God is telling us this is where the learning happens, right? This is, we're not here to judge as readers. We're here to learn from these experiences and to figure out how we can create our own nondescript happy families that nobody wants to write about.
Right, right. Well, yeah, we get that sense like the happiest time in the Book of Mormon, the most peaceful time is Fourth Nephi, and it's like a few verses long, right? It's 200 years of peace, and it's
And
like
everyone's great.
nothing to say here. Let's go back to war,
Yeah.
right?
We'd like a little bit more of an explanation of how that looked, right?
Yeah, I would love to know what those families actually looked like. But
Yeah.
it is one of the things I appreciate about the Book of Mormon, and very much feel like when prophets have said it's written for our day, right? That like it's written for me and my
Yeah.
family, right? It's I grew up in a family with four boys, kind of like Nephi, Sam, Laman, and Lemuel.
Yep.
We did not try to kill each other. We did not get to that point. But I know what that's like to be in a family with conflict. And I think everybody knows what that's like. And so the Book of Mormon gives us that very real view.
Yep. And also, as a mother of four boys, I'm here for Saraiah, right? Like,
Right, right.
I years ago, I remember when my children were reasonably young and just sort of entering their teen years, I read this hysterical podcast by a man who was explaining the teenage boy brain. And he said, if you wonder what they're thinking anytime they come into a conflict, there's a voice inside our head that says, have you tried violence? And that was really super helpful to me as I was raising these boys, where I'm like, okay, so there's a voice and I've got to be an alternate voice that says, maybe try this. So
Right. Well, and I think that's what we're going to try and do throughout this entire podcast, right?
Yeah.
Because there are lots of voices in our heads, whether it be the inner voice or sometimes external voices. Have you
Have you
tried?
tried violence,
Have
right?
you tried violence? Have you tried escalating the conflict? Have you tried attacking somebody? Have you tried, all these kinds of, there's lots of different kinds of violence, rhetorical violence, not just physical violence, emotional violence. And so we want to give some people some tools. And I really believe, and have just come to appreciate more and more the way that the Book of Mormon both outlines some of the challenges, some of the destructive conflicts that are just natural
Yeah.
as a part of as human beings making decisions, but also offering some ways out and giving us some wisdom as to how to do better.
Yep, I completely agree. They're really beautiful examples here of how we can do better. And we've talked about this in this early episode, the first episode, but I really think we have to take the prophets that wrote these books at their word when they say, we were imperfect and we want you to learn from us. And the biggest credit we can do, they made a lot of sacrifices to get these books to us, and to take them at their word and say, I am going to take this scripture seriously, and I am going to figure out, mine it for the lessons, so that me as a person in my relationship with God, me as part of a family, me as part of a society, I'm not contributing to these same problems, but I've been given opportunities to learn from other people's really tragic mistakes.
Yeah. So we'll talk over the next couple episodes about some of these dimensions. Obviously, we're not going to be able to cover every verse and every chapter in the book, but we really want to focus, I think, in a couple of places where that really matter for people today. So
Yeah.
interpersonal conflict, the conflicts that we have, especially within our families, and then in our next episode, we'll talk about forgiveness. How do we reckon with those kinds of things? And as we dive into today's episode. I was really struck by the interaction between Lehi and Saraiah in First Nephi chapter 5. And I don't think it had ever struck me in quite this way before. We always talk, and I think the kind of traditional narrative or the traditional reading of this chapter is Saraiah's complaining, Saraiah's murmuring. She needs to be kind of corrected by her husband so that she gets back on board. But as I read those verses carefully, and I want to recognize there's lots of ways to read this. This is the great thing about Scripture; it can be read differently, and also recognize that the culture back then is so different than our culture now, right? So
Yeah.
just marriages and families and every assumption about the way that men and women related to each other is just very different than the 21st century. But still, even with all that, I saw at least some clues or some hints as to what could look like some healthy conflict within
I
marriage.
agree.
So think about this. So the boys have been gone for who knows how long, right?
Or they're
It's
grown up.
dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody knew this was going to be dangerous. They
Yep.
haven't come back, obviously longer than what Saraiah had calculated in her head for how long it should have been. Um, I don't blame her one bit for complaining about this situation. I would have been. It's very human, right? And so I think in any relationship, especially a marriage, it's important for people to be honest about
Yep.
their feelings. And she's honest with her husband rather than bottling it up, right? She talks with her husband, and I appreciate that honesty and vulnerability. And she's mad at him,
Yeah.
right? That's a feature of any marriage.
Hmm.
And and then I appreciate actually the way he responds. Again, I think normally we read this as a kind of rebuke of her, but he says,
I
"I
don't
know
read it
that I'm
that
a
way at
visionary
all.
man."
Yeah. Yeah. No, I
Right.
really don't. I
Yeah.
have read it that way for years, but this close reading, I completely agree with you. It's different, right?
Yeah, he says, "I know that I'm a visionary man." There's a kind of like self-awareness there.
Yep.
Like, hey, my visions, I have to be true to myself, right? I
Hmm.
have to be true to the voice that I've heard, this revelation that I've received. I've brought us out into the wilderness. Again, there's some kind of hierarchy, or he's clearly leading the family, but he doesn't retaliate or counterattack. He doesn't browbeat her. He doesn't condemn her.
Doesn't
He
tell her
he
she's wrong. Mm-mm.
exactly. I read him as basically saying, "Look, I know what I'm asking is hard. Here we are. This is really tough, but I also still really believe that God's going to provide for us." All right, and so I actually kind of appreciate this story, and I just read it a different way this time.
Well, and one of the things that I love about that is I agree. I read this so differently, and I had never read this story in the same way. I'd read it traditionally the way you explained it. Like she's complaining, and he is like, no, 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 let me explain to you why you're wrong. But I don't think it's that at all. And visionary is such an interesting word there, right? Because visionary is awesome. It's amazing. Visionaries are the people that move us forward, but they often have like the least connected relationship with reality. We need visionaries, right? They're the people that push us forward, but visionaries
Right.
have got to be kind of hard to live with. And I think that he's claiming that. And he's like, I get that this is a hard thing about me. And now let me explain to you why I think this is going to be better for our family overall. And that he doesn't, and I love that they use the word over, I think a couple times where he says he did it to comfort her. So he
Hmm.
wasn't to fix her or to make her understand how he was right or to justify himself, but clearly his whole framework of approaching her was one of comfort, which is exactly what I think we all want our primary relationship to do for us. And what's interesting to me also is that we know that Nephi is telling this story retroactively
Yeah.
years later,
Yeah.
and yet the thing um, that he captures from that. And we don't know if it's because he captured that because he had the story in his father's own voice, that he was able to read that we are not. But clearly what comes out to him in that is that there was an attempt to comfort there, even
Yeah.
years later. That's the
Yeah.
thing that has
That's what
stuck
he
with him.
remembered. Yeah.
And I really,
So,
really appreciate that.
yeah. So, I mean, you and I could keep talking about this,
We
or we
could.
could bring in somebody who's actually an expert on
Who's
family
better?
conflict.
Who's
And
better than we are? So let's do that. Um,
right. So, yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so we are delighted to have us as our special guest today, Jennifer Finlayson-Fife. Jennifer earned her PhD in counseling psychology from Boston College, and she's been in private practice ever since, I guess, 2007. Through individual and couples counseling and a series of very popular online courses, many of you have probably participated in those, she focuses on empowering couples to create stronger and happier relationships. We can't think of anyone better to help us make sense of these family conflicts in First Nephi. And I think this is a perfect transition point. We've been talking about a marriage, and so let's get right into the text with her and hear her thoughts about it. We are so grateful to have her on our show. Can we start by asking you a question that we ask all of our visitors here on this podcast, and that is, peace is such a nebulous concept, and we were hoping if you could help us at the start of this conversation by sharing with our listeners how you define peace personally, either broadly or just for the purposes of this conversation about families.
Okay, it's a great question, and a little bit, I'm just sort of thinking about it on the spot. Let me start with what I think it isn't. It isn't the absence of difference. It's not the absence of conflict, even. I think it's finding a way to really be able to accept difference in ourselves, in others, and to work collaboratively towards a shared goal. It's, I think the body of Christ metaphor is such a beautiful one. To me, that's emblematic of peace, that we are playing different roles, understanding things from different perspectives, but working together and having not ever in the position, I have no need of thee. Right. So that's how I see it.
I love that. I love that sense of working collaboratively on working through the conflicts that are just kind of inevitable. They're just part of
Yeah.
life. That they're just part of what it means to have lots of human beings occupying the same planet, let alone the
Yes.
same household. Uh, and that's what I think is so interesting as we get into the Book of Mormon. Right up front, we're introduced to a family, right?
Yes.
Rather than like in the beginning or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Right up front, we're introduced to a family with real people, with parents and with kids and brothers and who are in conflict, and we're just all of a sudden we kind of land in the middle of this. And so as you think about this as First Nephi kind of sets up this family in
Mhm.
conflict, what immediately jumps out to you as you read this story about these characters, these people?
Well, there are a couple of things. And I was saying to my husband, this is going to be a tricky podcast in some ways because we sort of learn to not ever critique uh, church leaders scriptural heroes, and even though we're told the prophets are always real people and human and make mistakes, we don't really believe it. We don't like to believe
Yeah.
it. And I think that's a little bit part of the problem in creating peace, is that we very easily as humans think in binary terms. Someone's good or someone's bad. I can even do it when I'm working with a couple. My mind will go to who's the good one, who's the bad one. I mean, it's just so dumb. I'm like, Jennifer, knock it off. It's very easy to think like that. And so it's a little uncomfortable with a podcast because we're sort of taught to just see the scriptural text as Nephi and Lehi are obviously the good ones. Laman and Lemuel are obviously the bad ones. And we want to think of ourselves as being like Nephi, of course, rather than what I think is that human beings are both good and evil. We're capable of both. And I don't mean we're equally good and equally evil. I mean, and our choices matter, but we're capable of both. And so when we just vilify someone who's different than us, which we easily do, and we do it very much in our society now and in politics and so on, we interfere with the ability to actually learn from each other and create real peace. So I think what sort of jumps out at first is, in this narrative written by Nephi, it's really written in more of a binary way. I did the Lord's will, these guys didn't, right? And now we have the mess we've got, And so that stands out. It's very binary in terms of that. And then it's also very hierarchical. It's not really collaborative. It's not about this family working together to fulfill a task, a goal that they've been called to do. It's more in terms of some people getting the information, others not. Those that don't follow in line are the bad ones. Saraiah's bad for murmuring and doubting at some point, but it doesn't appear that she's privy to the same information and is just expected to go along. And so hierarchical relationships are very human. We do them very easily, but in the work I do, I teach people that they show them that they do them and how they interfere with intimacy, collaboration, and peace in relationships.
So this is something really interesting that I would love to jump off at, because there is this point of conflict. You're talking about it when there's a point in the scriptures when both Saraiah murmurs, right? And we've got Lehi who responds to her with comfort. We see that in the scriptures. He says, and Nephi's telling this story, and he says, Lehi responded after a manner that offered comfort to her and kind of brought her along. And then immediately thereafter, we see him in conflict with his brothers, and he points out their wrongness. And Nephi, by the way, let's stipulate, is absolutely right. Everything that he says is technically, doctrinally, correct, but it doesn't have that same effect on his brothers, right? They don't get to a place where they can hear the truth of what he's saying. So it struck me as I was reading that chapter that there are real hidden lessons there about the way that people who are in possession of truth can share that truth in a way that meets other people's needs, assuages their concerns, brings them along, or a way that doesn't do that, and maybe the result isn't as great. Are there some examples from your, experience that you could share with our listeners about how the mechanism of delivery is sometimes as important as the truth that you're delivering? Right? What is the underlying in the relationship that helps us deliver truth to loved ones in a way that they can hear it and that the relationship can support it?
Well, so again, this is kind of an off the cuff, so I'm trying to see if I can hold the complexity here and speak it in a simple way. But again, it has to do with this idea of hierarchical relationships. And there are healthy hierarchies in families. Parent-child is a healthy hierarchy. But the hierarchy exists to facilitate the autonomy and the agency of the younger person. So it's not about just getting them to do what you say. It's not unilateral control. It's basically giving enough structure, consequences, rules that facilitate the development of that child so that they can take on greater and greater autonomy, knowledge, and wisdom. And so it's needed. There's an inherent hierarchy. Where I get a little more uncomfortable is when it's like how did Nephi get it? And why is he condescending to his brothers, right? And so because that energy is there, it encourages the rebellion and the anger that then they can use to say, you see how evil Laman and Lemuel are, right? Rather than, it's not just the way it's communicated. I appreciate what you're saying, Jen, but I think it's also, what is the meaning here, which is, how to say it, that you understand what it is you're asking of someone else. You are talking to them like they're really your equal, and you understand something about why they might be getting stuck around that. And you're talking to them like with the dignity and compassion of how you might feel if you were in their shoes. So it's really the way you see the other person. And so rebuking is probably not going to be something you're doing with a sibling or an adult child. You're going to be more stepping into their shoes and thinking about what their interests are and why they might be getting caught up in something. You're speaking to the best in them. You're speaking to the part of them that wants to live well also. And you're also taking time to understand what they experience and they see that you do not see. Because when we're too confident that we've got the right way, we're no longer seeking to understand. And we're actually maybe more blind ourselves than we realize while we're busy trying to tell others how to be.
That's really interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking I've not done this exercise to go through and count, but it'd be interesting to do to count how many times each character in First Nephi asks questions and what
Yeah,
kind of questions they ask.
right.
Just on my kind of gut level, as having read through it, but again, not done the tally. Laman and Lemuel do ask some open-ended questions. There are moments where they're
You're
seeking
trying to
meaning.
understand.
There are
Yeah.
other moments where they're not. Right?
Yeah.
Nephi does ask a lot of questions. Sometimes they're rhetorical questions. They're questions that are kind of loaded. And so yeah, as you talk about really trying to get into and empathetically get into the mind space, the head space of somebody else is an important tool. I wanted to ask you, so as we look throughout this narrative in First Nephi, it's easy for us to mark and list off all the kind of presenting symptoms of the conflict, like brothers beating up other brothers, right? People threatening to kill a
Yeah.
prophet, tying people up, I mean,
Yeah.
beheading people, right? We can talk about the presenting issues, but it seems that at least as I've learned, we can look at the presenting issues, and of course those matter, but generally they are speaking to there are underlying causes underneath the
Yes.
surface. There's
Yeah.
something deeper going on than just this one instance of brothers beating up brothers. So can you
Right.
talk about what's this relationship between presenting symptoms and underlying factors in family conflict?
Well, when there's really binary behavior, what I mean is there's extremes. There's the over functioning, and then there's the sibling that's in jail and so on. I don't mean to say that it's always about the culture of the family, because people can have oppositional defiant disorder, have neurological challenges, and so on. But often when there's extremes in a marriage, somebody with very high desire, someone with very low desire, there's often a lot more contempt going on in the family system than meets the eye. And so, what happens often in a strong hierarchical family is you have those that are compliant and get the sort of good boy status, and then those that are defiant because they feel like they're losing their agency if they just go along. And so they're kind of more in the like, I don't get the credit that my brother gets, so I'm going to get attention by rebelling, because bad breath is better than no breath. And so and so then that kind of will create division, and often then somebody gets to be even a better student, even more
Yeah.
invested in their parents' approval, and the other one gets even more and more angry. And so those divisions often they kind of mask dysfunction in those that look like the overfunctioners, and they mask strength in the one that's rebelling and wisdom in the one that's rebelling. And so you have to often get at the heart of what is in the family structure and what's going on in the leadership of the family structure. Mm-hmm.
So this is great. I mean, obviously we have a very short time frame here to analyze non-existent invisible families, but I would love it if you could maybe share if a family feels that that dynamic that you've just described is playing out. What are some positive and affirmative things that either as siblings, if we're older siblings, or as parents, that we can do to try to break that cycle? Because we see how it plays out. It plays out with continuing and escalating conflict, just like you've described. So we'd love our listeners to have some strategies that they could start to explore. If they see this happening in their own family, what are some ways that they can affirmatively try to think differently about their family members and break out of it?
You want to listen to the unrighteous one. You want to listen to the underfunctioning one,
Okay.
because they have a lot more information than we want to think. That is, a lot of times, this is just sort of family therapist speech, but is, like the family trash can. It's the one that kind of is the scapegoat for the family. Often is carrying a burden in the family that the family isn't ready or able to integrate yet. They don't want to grow into more wisdom. They want their worldview to prevail. And so they kind of dismiss or hurt the one that they don't want to deal with the truth that one holds. And so if I were doing family therapy with Lehi's family, I would want to talk first to Laman and Lemuel in a family session in which they could talk about what is it like to be Nephi's brother? What's it like to be Lehi's son? And what do you wish they understood about your experience? And what do you think that they don't see about themselves? And just to challenge the one up, one down by really elevating the experience of the one down and how much they actually understand. Because when you're in the, well, God called me and I'm doing everything right, you can be really blind to your own liabilities and what it's like to be in relationship with you. And so, if Nephi and Lehi could repent a little bit, right? Look more at how they may well be called of God, but the way that they're handling that calling is working against the well-being of the family as a whole, that they may be a part of the murmuring, right? And so if you can start to confront your role in your family member's dysfunction, to use that language, or their underfunctioning, well, then you start to get a little more humble. You start to get a little more fair. You start to say, maybe I need to do more for them and their benefit. And then I would be talking to Laman and Lemuel after that about how they're using rebellion as a kind of pseudo agency, right? That they're so busy just rebelling and proving that they're not going to be bossed around, that they're not actually owning their strength, and they're actually reinforcing the power hierarchy by just rebelling against it, rather than who am I and what do I actually think, and what is my relationship to God, and what do I feel is best. And I'm actually working against my own self-respect when I'm so busy just rebelling against Nephi. So it's helping the underdog start to own more of their actual strength and not just be in reaction to the top dog. Mm-hmm.
I love that. And so, okay, let's keep this family in therapy. Okay, I
Mm-hmm.
like this. Unfortunately, I don't think you had an office in the wilderness in
No,
Bountiful.
I wanted to stay in
There was kind
Jerusalem.
of a
Yeah,
shortage of mental health
yeah,
professionals
yeah.
at the
But,
time. But
mhm.
let's say this family keeps coming back to you for therapy. I mean, there is real harm that's being done, right? We can say,
Yeah.
okay, Nephi's words, Nephi could be a little softer, a little gentler, a little more understanding. He could ask more questions, but but also, he's the one getting beat up.
True.
He's the one whose life is being threatened. There is the electric shock thing, so there is some reciprocal stuff a little bit later in the story, but how do you talk with families where there is real harm being done
Yeah.
by some parties, even if they do feel like they're under recognized, underappreciated, and these dynamics are playing out? But we also have to address the harm.
Oh, for sure. And you have to stop harm first, right? You can't, whatever the cause, you can't have somebody abusing or harming anyone, right? Even if you understand how they got there.
Yeah.
So you do have to set limits, and maybe Layman and Lemuel would need to be in jail, but you still might conduct some sessions from
Right.
jail. So, so, uh, so yeah, you definitely don't want to be complicit in harm, even if it's understandable as a reaction. Yeah.
Sure. So,
Mhm.
I want to continue this with, so you've talked about what, especially this conflict between Nephi and his brothers. What about Lehi and Saraiah? What do you see going on here? We have this great chapter. You mentioned it a little bit earlier. We oftentimes talk about Saraiah murmuring and doubting and so forth. And Jen talked about Lehi comforting her. What do you see in this marriage, or what would be some of the questions that you'd want to ask them, or some insights you'd want to help them bring out as you talk to
I
them?
mean, this is me speaking from 2024, looking
Sure.
back on
Yeah.
this story. So I'm a little bit uncomfortable, but I guess what I see is that, and this was just what the culture was at the time, is it's a hierarchical relationship marriage, right?
Yeah.
And so Lehi's getting the information, and Soraya is good for believing and going along. And if she doesn't believe and go along, that's part of her deficiency, because she should believe and go along. And I think it's really only more recently that we've started to think about marriage differently than that. Just 100
Yeah.
years ago, women got the vote, because why have a redundant vote? That was the thinking. If a man's going to vote, the wife is, of course, going to do the same thing, right? And so just women's agency is a relatively newer way of thinking. And so we're much more, at least the work I do is much more around creating collaborative partnerships, and where men and women occupy different ways of being in the world. But how do you actually value and collaborate and work together? That's not the marriage model I see there. And so again, Sarai is in a more dependent position. It was culturally how it was, but it's not really. Lehi gets a bigger vote, right? They're not counseling together on whether or not they're going in the wilderness, that we see at least from the scriptures. Lehi's had a vision and understands what they need to do, and so she goes along. Now she may trust him and know that he's holding her best interests at heart. I think she does, because she is comforted by him. But that's the quality that I see in that, at least that scriptural account. Mhm.
So, one of the things that I find so interesting again in that account is we've got this narrative where Nephi goes head to head with his brothers, and he kind of explains to them where he thinks they're going wrong. And they respond essentially with violence. They're frustrated and angry. And then very shortly thereafter, we have some newcomers to the family who engage. And we've got, the daughters of Ishmael, who are able to engage in the same situation in a way. They are able to kind of move into a family dynamic that's new to them. They've just
Mhm.
joined this family, or, joined this
Yeah.
whole endeavor. And something about the quality of their engagement is clearly very different, because they
Mhm.
are able to not only de-escalate the conflict, but
Mhm.
they are able to create a situation in which, for one of the first times, we see Laman and Lemuel feel sincere sorrow for something that
Mhm.
they've done, right?
Yeah. Right.
Um, and and so, even though in this situation we obviously have women, just like you've said, who are in a hierarchical relationship, they somehow were able to exercise their agency to
Mhm.
resolve a conflict in a way that other people were not. And that is something that I find so inspiring in this particular set of chapters. And so I would ask you if you could share with us maybe some ideas about, even if your situation isn't ideal, we need to
Mhm.
work towards having the relationships that you've talked about be equal and fair and just and
Mhm.
collaborative. But what are some things that we can do in our families currently to communicate in a way that is going to actually be more effective? Like, there's going to be
Mhm.
bring peace. And I don't mean peace as in peacekeeping, I mean peace as in peacemaking, right? That
Yeah.
is going to bring people to a point where they're willing to change. Do you have any suggestions on that? How to do that well and how to do it poorly, maybe?
Yeah. Well, how to do it poorly is with judgment, condescension, telling people how they should be, and the kind of the assumption of when you're going to get it together. Kind of
Yeah.
you're looking at them as a problem. I mean, the opposite of that is you look at the best in people, and you're appealing to the best in them, and you're appealing to what they also want. Like in this country, 99 plus percent of us want a peaceful environment that's safe for our children,
Mm-hmm.
where we can thrive and do well and have growing businesses and take care of the needy. And, we all want that. And then we get into these ideas where we see the other one is not wanting it and working against it and a threat, rather than how do they experience society? Why do they think as they do? So you're seeing them like they're like me and they're good people. We all do
Yeah.
evil, but they're basically decent people. So why do
Mm-hmm.
they see it so differently? There's an answer to that, and there's probably a good reason for seeing it differently. And there's something I can learn from them, because when you feel understood, you're open to understanding the other. You're open to their input. If you don't feel understood and you just feel judged, you're like, forget it. I'm not going to listen to your idea about how I should be because you have no interest in understanding
Yeah.
me. So you have to genuinely want to understand and tolerate the discomfort of understanding. Because sometimes when I've understood people who think differently than me, I'm like, I want to tell them how they're wrong because I don't want to grow. That's the thing. It's not because they're so wrong. It's that I don't want to actually have my mind get pushed by their different perspective. And so I have to often just calm myself down enough to say, I, am strong enough to claim truth wherever it is. And if it's if it's in a different way of thinking and I need to grow my own perspective, I want to be able to do that. So it's like twofold. It's both seeking to understand, and then that person feels understood and they're more receptive to you. But also your view is getting shaped and made wiser by really understanding another perspective, so that what you have to say might actually be valuable.
I would love if you would extrapolate a little bit, because I think this is something I could personally learn a lot. How do you prepare yourself to receive that truth? Like, if you're in a relationship, a long-standing relationship that you really matters to you, which is true of most families,
Sure.
what are the things that are in my control that I can do to prepare myself to hear, someone else's experience in a way that
Yes.
I.
So my son gave me permission to talk about this a little bit because I've brought it up before on a podcast. But when he was in his late adolescence or late high school, he was really struggling and was moving into depression and really having a hard time. And, in one of my conversations with him, he said, "Mom, you are a terrible listener." Okay. So I'm like,
You're like, it's your whole
I'm a
identity,
professional
right?
listener. That's what I do. Okay.
Go straight to my core, buddy. Thanks.
Exactly. He's like, why anybody would pay for you, I have no idea. No, he didn't say that, but still, he was telling me I was a terrible listener. And the truth was, he was dead on, because with other people's kids, I'm a great listener. With him, I was a terrible listener
Because
because
the
I
stakes
didn't,
were high,
the
right?
stakes were high and I didn't
Yeah.
want what he was saying. I'm like, well, just don't do that. Just don't think about it that way. Think about it this way. I'm in a panic because he's struggling in a way that I don't understand, that I didn't anticipate. And so that was just really good self-awareness, because I was then thinking, in the next, before I had the next conversation with him, how am I going to help and love someone that I'm too panicked to actually understand?
Yeah,
What is
here.
going on for him is going on for him, whether or not
Yeah.
I listen to it. And so, and how he thinks, you know, whether or not I can shape it is another question, but I ought to at least understand how he thinks. And he should at least understand it by me listening
Yeah.
to him, because that's all I've got. And if I'm just going to love him, this was my own self-rebuking. I just have to know who he is, even if it's painful or hard or scary for me. And so it was just like calling myself to repentance around, I'm not doing my job. And if I'm going to do my job as his parent and the one that loves him, then I just have to calm myself down and tolerate knowing what is true. I
Yeah.
also think this is the other way. It's like, I remember my brother way back before faith crises were cool and everything was going through a faith crisis. Was going through a faith crisis. I was just starting at BYU as a freshman, and he was reading some books at early church history and was talking to me about them, and I was completely uninterested in hearing his experience. And I remember as I was, driving home that night, I remember praying and thinking, I'm going to just avoid my brother, like as an act of faith. And I remember just the clear sense that that's faithless of you, right? Because if the truth can withstand loving your brother, right? And it's a similar idea, like truth and love go together. And if I love my son, I need to know what is true. And I can tolerate knowing what's true, even if it's hard. And that's going to help me be better, wiser, and more capable of love. So gird up your loins and go in there and listen, and just listen to what he has to say. And don't give the yeah, but, because that's not listening. And don't be spending the time that he's talking thinking about what you're going to say, because that's also not listening. Seek to understand, which is an active process.
I've got another question, but I think that leads right into a question, Jen, that you had that you wanted to ask about relationships.
Yeah. So I love Marjorie Hinckley's saying. I was lucky enough to grow up with her and President Hinckley in my ward, and she's just I can't express what a warm, generous human being she was. And she has this beautiful saying about families where she says, above all else, preserve the relationship. And I thought it was lovely when I was younger, and it has become, for me, I think, one of the saving graces of parenting, right? Just this voice in my head, above all else, preserve the relationship. I think Layman and Lemuel give us a really great example, Nephi, this whole family, of the fact that people have agency, they make different choices, and even faithful behavior on the part of parents or families doesn't result in overriding that agency. And so we are going to, if we're good people, we're going to do everything you've just shared with us. We're going to do everything we can to prepare ourselves to hear truth. We're going to try to break negative family dynamics. We're going to be affirmative in trying to improve our families. But there are going to be limits to our ability to control the outcomes, right? We just all have to acknowledge that. And so sometimes we find ourselves, I think, increasingly in situations where families, parents feel like they have to, in this really high stakes environment where family matters so much in the restored gospel and in our culture, they feel like I have to kind of either choose between God or I have to choose between my children, right? And in that high stakes situation, there is just often this, I think, a feeling of which relationship do I preserve, right? And I don't necessarily believe that I think that's a false dichotomy. As I guess I will just present my opinion that is completely a false dichotomy. And I would just love some of your professional, personal, spiritual insight on how people who truly believe, that there is a Christ who redeems and that we can have a relationship with him, how he can guide us towards not being pulled into that dichotomous thought pattern, right?
Yeah.
That we can preserve both of those relationships even while existing in a place where our families might not be functioning or we might not be getting the outcomes that we'd once hoped for.
Yes. Yeah, well, I think there's nothing like parenting to teach you about your limits on control.
Amen.
I mean, especially as you have young adults and so on, and it's humbling and it's pushing you to learn more about what love actually is. And probably my greatest example of this is my own mother, who, she is just a person who is deeply and genuinely accepting of all of her children, those in the church and those who've left. She just is able to do that. And like without qualification, you don't have this sense like there's a secret favoritism going on. She just genuinely loves, even if she worries about maybe their well-being in some cases, right? Or whether or not their lives are accruing to something that will actually be happy for them. But that was never connected to her love and valuing of them. And I think she just saw it as like, well, God is bigger than our understanding. And even though she had, children who are not going to church and all that, she was just like, look, I know how good my children are, and God knows how good my children are. And I trust that it's going to be okay, right? Because I'm not here to judge why they're choosing what they're choosing, because I'm not in their experience. And I have my own issues to get worked out. I've got my own sin to get worked out. So she just wasn't busy making decisions about how others should be acting or how God was going to judge it, because she wasn't in their experience. And so my mom, I love the parable of the prodigal son because this father represents, you know, you know, of course, Israel and his sons, they had some, would like to do some therapy with them too. Some of the same problems. They were called to do something that God needed, right? But some
Yeah.
of the family issues were interfering with the mission in a sense, right?
Yeah.
But with the prodigal son, the father of the prodigal son, like he's like, I love both of my sons. And the one that's having a hard time is the stalwart son, the righteous one who's saying, wait a minute, I've been here earning all the credit and you throw a big party for the wayward one,
Hmm.
And he's like, no, don't you understand? Like, maybe the one who doesn't sin has an easier life because he doesn't have to live in some of the negative consequences, but both are beloved equally. And so I think it's just like it's not when we think, okay, my sense of myself as a parent is being measured by my child's behavior, well, you're going to have a hard time loving your child then.
Yeah.
Because your sense of self is walking around on them and their decisions. If you can though say like, that's not my job, that's their job, that's their agency. My job is to love them, to see them the way God sees them, to value them, to care about their well-being. You can care about them making decisions that work against them, of course, because you care about them. But that's different than you're going to get them to choose differently. That's on them. And if you love them, well, then they trust you and they trust your input. And, one of my brothers who was gone from the church for 20 years and kind of hit a crisis point in his life. And then he just wanted to come back and he came back to church and was in the back of a sacrament meeting and they sang a favorite hymn and he just cried and cried and cried. And he just wanted to come back. Amazing to talk about it. But, there was no sense of having to save face with his other
Family.
right, with his family. He just could just come back. And it was like, we still love you in either way. And if this is what you need, we're glad you're here. So it's that just means there's no barrier, no ego to protect in those decisions.
So I will hand this to Patrick, but I will just say, as if I could give any advice to parents of young children, I think Jennifer's advice here is spot on. And I think from my own experience, as kids grow up and start to make these decisions, if we want to retain the relationship with them, we have to transition to the kind of relationship you've just talked about, one that's not based on fear, not based on control, not based on love. And I just wish I had done that and practiced that from the very beginning, rather than having to come to learn it at tension points in my life and in my kids' lives. And so I think it's easier if we can just say that is the way we want to parent, and we can practice it when the stakes feel a little bit lower. It's going to be easier to do it when the stakes get really high.
Yeah, and I'll also underscore, I mean, for my money, the parable of the prodigal son, that is the gospel right there. That is, for me, that's the purest articulation of the gospel that Jesus ever gave. And I always think about it as the parable of the prodigal father. Actually, he's prodigal with his love. He's just he will just give his love anywhere and everywhere. He's not stingy with his love. Okay, so let me ask. We're running out of time. Let me ask one more question before we kind of wrap things up. We all know, those of us who have read the Book of Mormon before know not only how it begins but also how it ends, right? And this is it's a tragic story, and spoilers for anybody who hasn't read the Book of Mormon yet. But it does not end well, and this begins with just a family squabble. Right.
Yeah.
This is just brothers fighting. Every family has this, or kids who disagree with their parents. Right. Every single family, I'm sure, in the history of families can relate to this. And it ends in genocide. Right. I mean, this is the ultimate. I mean, what I've heard described as kind of conflict tornado, where it just spins and spins and then brings in more people into it, and people get sucked in and more issues get sucked in, and it gets more and more energy. It feeds and feeds and feeds until now all of a sudden it is just destroys everything in its path, including the entire Nephite civilization. So how do we stop the conflict tornado? Right? If we feel ourselves in a conflict, whatever that might be, right? In our families, in our workplaces, in a ward, in our marriage, whatever that might be, what is something that I can do to stop the conflict tornado in my life?
Yeah. This is so much the work I do is trying to stop conflict tornadoes because
Tornadoes.
they make people so unhappy and yet they're so easy to do, right?
Yeah,
Destruction,
because they do take on their own energy, right?
they do. And destruction is easy and makes you feel powerful.
Yeah.
Really, it does. And being constructive is harder and requires a lot more precision and self-control and so on. And so we have destructiveness is tempting. That is. And what I mean by that is not necessarily getting a rod and beating somebody up destructive, but just the indulgence of how to say it, of vilifying the other person that disagrees with you. That alone, I can't believe they said that. Can you believe they said that? And then I said this really nice thing. And then they said this really ridiculous thing. And then I said this really reasonable thing. And we just see ourselves that way. And what do we do when we feel that way? Rather than that inkling inside of us, like maybe you played a role, maybe a
Yeah.
small one, but maybe you had something to do with their ridiculous position. Instead of confronting that and taking a look at your own role in the problem, which is hard to see because we literally have beams in our eyes and we can see
Yeah.
the beam in our partner's eye or our neighbor's eye, that we want to stay blind to ourselves rather than look at ourselves. So it's always looking at ourselves. And what we do instead of that is we go and look for accomplices. Can you believe that? You see people getting a divorce, and the first thing they start doing is getting accomplices. Who's going to be on the wife's side? Who's going to be on the husband's side? And it's just a very intuitive thing because you want backup for your position when you don't want to self-confront. And then it's very easy to get caught in a narrative of the bad guys and we're the good ones, and it feels good. Tribalism is at our core. Feels good to be like, we're in the good tribe. And all those idiots over there. I mean, you get on YouTube and you see so and so takes down, political opponent, whatever. And people like that because, like, oh, it feels good to see the other side getting taken down. And that is so bad for us. That is so bad for us. And it makes us feel good, but we're in a distortion about reality and about other people that is destructive.
Yeah, it is. I mean, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm part of the evil tribe today, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
we're all the hero of our own story.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
Well,
exactly.
and I just add to this one of the lessons that is, in some ways, it's so sad that you see a family conflict spiral up into this tornado that, results in cultural conflict and war and ultimately this mass slaughter. I think actually what that can also be is incredibly empowering to us to realize that we actually have a lot of power as peacemakers in some
Yes.
critical moments to honestly change the course of civilizations,
Yeah.
to change the narratives, certainly of our own families, right? I think
Yeah.
hopefully enough of us know enough family history to know stories of at least one or two people who have stepped in at pivotal moments to alter for good the course of our family, right?
Yes.
And
That's
and I
absolutely true.
yeah, and I don't want to white knight that too much because just like you said, the productive work of building these strong, healthy relationships is long and slow and
Yes.
plodding and requires us to be fairly self-sacrificial. But I think the payoff is big. And
That's
I
right.
just want to
And what you
acknowledge
do
that.
makes a difference, even
Yeah.
in those little moments, right? I think it's David Brooks that just wrote a book about understanding others. I've only heard
Yeah.
him talk about it, not read it yet, but about just those moments of actually asking questions, seeking to understand, building a bridge, understanding, not what do you do or what, but how did you come to that? What is your story? Because we learn a lot by reaching to others, but also then it impacts how they feel and how they see the world. And so really thinking of ourselves as moral agents that we have these ripple effects and to not undervalue that. So we're not going to change the world, any one of us, but the small good we do makes a difference and never forget it. Just as our indulgent moments make a difference in a negative way. Mm-hmm.
yep. Well, great. Okay, so we want to wrap up by asking you one final question that we ask of all of our guests. in this world of conflict and conflict tornadoes and everything else,
Children,
what are
children.
children, right? What are one or two things or places or ways that you find peace?
Okay, well, I would say it's hard to answer in one quick question, but I would say I look to do things that are good because when I do good, it actually is a reminder that good is real, right? And there is good around us because I think when you can become aware of the dark and the dark can feel consuming, the antidote to that is to do good because you are an agent and can make the world better and can shape not just another's experience, but your own experience. And I really look for beauty. Like I listen to classical music and beauty in nature and beauty in other people. The good that, when I see clients do courageous things, it like touches my soul. It helps me remember that courage and doing the right thing is so important. So it's just both creating it and looking for it and holding on to it. So, and I I love my husband and being next to him gives me peace too. So
Yeah, I
yeah.
love that. Well, that's a pretty good testament from a family therapist, right? Helping us all realize that that's possible and something we
Yeah.
should reach for, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Jennifer,
Yeah.
thank you so much. I've learned a lot from this, and I know everybody else will too. Thank you for your
Yeah, thank you.
expertise, for your faith, and everything you bring to bring peace into the world.
Thank you so much. Fun to
Thanks
talk to
for
both of
joining
you.
us.
Thanks everybody for watching today. We just want to remind you, as always, to subscribe to the podcast, to rate and review us. We love hearing feedback from people, so please leave feedback. You can email us at podcast@mweg.org. And we also want to invite you to think about ways that you can make peace in your life this week. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.